They said sweetness was a blessing, but in 1758 Virginia, sweetness was a mask, one that hid the quietest form of rebellion America had ever known. Inside a candlelit plantation house, a child reached for his sugared tea and swallowed death disguised as luxury. The mother screamed for a doctor, the servants watched in silence, and somewhere beyond the polished silver, a 19-year-old housemaid stared into the flames, knowing exactly what she had done. This isn't a ghost story. It's a record of vengeance written in sugar and ash, a truth buried under the polite rituals of empire. You were never meant to hear it because it exposes the most dangerous kind of rebellion, the one that uses gentility as its weapon. In the world of 18th century Virginia, sugar wasn't just food. It was a symbol of refinement, of whiteness, of power. Every grain imported from the Caribbean carried the labor of thousands who bled to make it shine. Sugar wasn't sweet. It was the crystallized currency of domination. To serve it meant obedience. To control it meant access to death itself. The household ledger that survives from that year tells us only fragments, a few purchases, a few illnesses, and one brief entry. Kitchen maid, age 19, no name, no origin, no mention after that date. But another record, the estate physician's, lists 3 dead children in the same season. Summer flux, he wrote, God's will. But God doesn't measure doses. Imagine the kitchen that summer. Smoke hanging low, copper pots bubbling, a faint sweetness in the air that masks everything. Rot, sweat, fear. The maid, her hands raw from labor, lifts the lid of a jar. White crystals glint under the firelight. Sugar or arsenic. To the human eye they are twins. To history one was worshipped and the other forgotten. She wasn't educated in rebellion, not in the way men write about war. Her war was quieter. Every spoonful she stirred was a choice, to feed the hand that struck her or to fold justice into its mouth. In this house, vengeance didn't shout, it dissolved. And that's why the archives stay silent, because what she did terrified those who built their world on control. It wasn't just that she killed, it's that she revealed the truth they could never admit. That power, when built on cruelty, always poisons itself. Tonight, you'll hear the story they buried, the one where luxury turns to decay and where sweetness becomes sin. A story erased from marble, but alive in whispers, in ledgers, in the strange mathematics of justice written by the oppressed. So lean closer, because once you hear what really happened in that kitchen, you'll never taste sweetness the same way again. The planters of Virginia believed civility protected them. They believed their wealth insulated them from consequence, that porcelain, lace, and the scent of sugared tea could keep decay from their walls. But refinement, in truth, was the most fragile armor ever made, because beneath that elegance there was rot, not the kind that eats wood, but the kind that eats souls. The plantation kitchen was the artery of the entire estate, the unseen machine that kept the illusion alive. Fire crackled from dawn until night. Iron pots hissed. The scent of boiled fruit and baked bread bled into the plaster. It was in this space, this narrow room of smoke and sweat, that empire truly lived. And it was here that it began to die. The housemaid, the unnamed girl of 19, moved between the shadows with the practiced quiet of someone who has learned that sound brings punishment. Her hands, blistered from washing silver and lifting kettles, moved as if guided by something older than thought, an ancestral rhythm of labor, of patience, of waiting. Every movement in that kitchen was surveillance. Every glance was recorded by someone's eyes. The mistress of the house, proud of her refinement, would occasionally descend to the kitchen, not to help, but to display authority. She would comment on the amount of sugar used in preserves, on the shine of the silver, on the obedience of the servants. To her, the maid was invisible until she made a mistake, but invisibility, when embraced, becomes a cloak. The housemaid knew something the mistress never could, that silence is power, that when you are beneath notice, you can move freely. When your name is erased, you can act without history's chain. Sugar was the mistress's obsession. It came in small barrels wrapped in linen, imported from Barbados at enormous cost. She kept it locked in a mahogany chest in her parlor, a chest carved with angels as if to bless what had been bled from hell. Only she and her maid held the key. Each morning she would hand the key to the girl with a simple order: measure precisely, not 1 spoon more. And each morning the maid would curtsy, take the key, and vanish into the kitchen haze. It was here that the balance shifted. Next to the sugar jar sat another, unlabeled, pale, crystalline, arsenic. Used for rats, insects, sometimes for illness, it was part of the colonial apothecary, kept close at hand. To the eye, there was no difference. To the hand, no weight. To the taste, only death. The first substitution might have been accidental, or perhaps it wasn't. The day after, the eldest boy grew sick, vomiting, fever, tremors. The physician called it summer flux. He prescribed bleeding and prayer. The mother wept over the boy's bedside, never suspecting the hand that fed him had written the illness in sugar. The maid said nothing. She brought cool cloths, fetched water, and kept her eyes lowered. Silence was her confession and her alibi, because she understood the one truth forbidden to speak aloud. In a world where your body belongs to another, the only way to reclaim it is through quiet destruction. The family's power came from consumption, of land, of labor, of sugar, of lives. But what happens when the consumed begin to feed something back into that system? Something invisible. This was not a moment of madness. It was a ritual, the inverse of communion, the turning of sweetness into sin. For centuries, the ruling class had used ceremony to sanctify their domination, dinner tables as thrones, meals as proof of control. Now, in that Virginia kitchen, ceremony became rebellion. The same porcelain that once displayed power now carried its undoing. Every plate became a battlefield, every teacup a weapon, every smile at the table a blindfold. By the time the second child fell ill, rumors began to stir among the servants' quarters. Whispers of witchcraft, of African poisons, of curses brought from across the sea. The white physicians called it hysteria, but in their fear, they were closer to the truth than they knew. Because this wasn't witchcraft. It was justice written in code, in teaspoons, in silence, in patience. The planters built their empire on control, but no man can control what he refuses to see. They forgot that the ones who serve you are the ones who touch your food, your bed, your breath. The housemaid's war didn't need muskets or fire. It needed only proximity, and the courage to turn sweetness against the ones who had made her world bitter. Her rebellion had no witnesses, no battlefields, no graves with names. It existed between heartbeat and breath, between sugar and poison, between silence and survival. And it worked. There's a reason the past is written in ledgers, not in diaries, not in confessions, but in numbers, because numbers feel safe. They pretend to tell the truth while hiding everything that matters. The plantation ledger of 1758 Virginia was immaculate. Every purchase, every death, every transaction tallied in the same steady hand. Tobacco yields, livestock births, broken tools, pounds of sugar consumed, and yet something in those pages trembles. In the summer of that year, the entries for sugar doubled. 2 barrels ordered within 3 weeks. That's impossible for a household of that size. The mistress recorded it without question. Vanity rarely audits itself. But in those unbalanced columns lies a confession the planter never saw. Because excess leaves a trail. The unnamed maid, written once and never again, disappears from the ledger shortly after the last barrel was purchased. No sale recorded, no death, no transfer to another estate. Just absence. The kind of silence history uses to bury inconvenient truth. But the ledger betrays itself. On the same week her name vanishes, the entry reads, 3 children ill, doctor summoned, expense for tinctures and herbs. Beneath that, sugar chest relocked. That line, sugar chest relocked, is more than an observation. It's panic. The family had begun to suspect something they couldn't afford to speak aloud, because to question the safety of your own table is to admit that the hierarchy is fragile, to admit that those beneath you hold the power of life and death. But they did not write poison. They wrote providence. They wrote God's will. They needed their faith to survive the fear that their own house had turned against them, and perhaps it had. The historian who unearthed the surviving ledger in the 1920s described its ink as fevered. That's an odd word for penmanship, isn't it? But it fits. The entries that summer grew erratic, uneven, as though the planter's hand shook. The arithmetic doesn't add up. A livestock sale vanishes mid-column. Expenses spike, then flatten. It's as if someone tried to rewrite reality before it settled into history. The maid, too, becomes a ghost in the text. Her presence erased, her absence undeniable. The space she once occupied, the space where her name should have been written, becomes the wound through which the truth bleeds. When you read that ledger today, it feels cold, but it hums with energy. Because every omission has a temperature, every lie has a pulse. And here's the part the archives never admit. The ledgers weren't meant to preserve history. They were meant to control it. To list a person as property was to turn them into math, to strip them of narrative, and to erase them from the math was to kill them twice, once in the body and once in memory. But sometimes erasure becomes evidence, the sudden spike in sugar purchases, the unaccounted disappearance, the parallel deaths. These aren't coincidences, they're the fingerprints of an invisible war. Think about what that means. In a world where no rebellion could be spoken, the ledger itself became the battlefield. Every column a coded message, every silence a scream. Some scholars call this archival haunting. I call it the revenge of truth, because what the plantation tried to bury, the violence, the humiliation, the power inverted, never disappeared. It just changed form. It lives inside the documents that thought they destroyed it. That's the paradox of power. The more you try to sanitize history, the more you expose your fear of what you've done. And it's that fear, not guilt, that keeps the record incomplete. Imagine the mistress of the house weeks later, locking the sugar chest herself, the key trembling in her hand, her children weak, her prayers unanswered, her trust dissolved like arsenic in tea. She would glance toward the kitchen and feel something new. Not pity, not command, but dread, because she finally understood what she had always denied, that every system of control rests on borrowed obedience, and obedience can vanish at any moment. Some say the housemaid fled into the woods, others say she was caught and hanged in secret, but no record proves either story, only that after that summer the estate never recovered. The fields went untended, the family line ended, the ledger stopped, and that is the truest proof of all. Not the words written, but the silence that followed, because sometimes the most powerful rebellion is the one that leaves no witnesses, no signatures, and no survivors. They prayed as their children convulsed. They whispered psalms through trembling lips, clutching silver crosses over hearts that had long forgotten mercy. The great house of Virginia had turned into a chapel of fear. And still, they never asked the only question that mattered. What if God wasn't punishing them? What if someone else was? The plantation was built on illusion, on the belief that hierarchy was holy, that obedience was natural, that those who suffered were meant to. From the pulpit to the parlor, every verse, every sermon, every toast to order and grace reinforced the same lie, that power was divine. But in that summer of 1758, divinity began to rot. The same hands that lit candles for prayer also stirred the spoon that carried death. The same mouth that praised providence tasted its opposite, human retribution disguised as heavenly will. And that's the secret that terrified them most, because if a nameless servant could reverse the current of power, if sweetness could become a weapon, then the foundation of their world was not divine at all. It was mortal, fragile, corrupt. The family's pastor, Reverend Hallowell, wrote in his journal that evil spirits have entered the house through the kitchen. He blamed African witchcraft, the easy scapegoat for white guilt. He claimed the illness was a curse sent through food, that the devil had found a vessel in one of the Negro girls. He gathered the household for prayer and demanded confession, but the maid remained silent. And silence is what power fears most. Because silence isn't absence, it's control. It's knowing that your oppressor's imagination will do more damage than your words ever could. The mistress wept during the prayers, begging forgiveness, though she couldn't name the sin she was repenting for. She only knew something in her house had turned. The air felt wrong, the silver tarnished too quickly, the sugar tasted bitter. For generations, they had used faith as a chain. Sermons preached submission, quoting scripture to sanctify servitude. "Servants, obey your masters," the Bible said, and they built an empire from that one line. But the maid's quiet rebellion exposed the scripture for what it really was, a weapon to disguise hunger for control. And now, that control was slipping. When the family buried their first child, they did it at dawn. No ceremony, no record, just a shallow grave near the orchard, where the soil was soft. The housemaid was ordered to dig, but she refused. The overseer struck her, then ordered the gardener to finish the work. The next morning, he too fell sick. That's when fear became hysteria. The mistress began to dream of the maid standing over her bed at night, holding a silver spoon. The reverend insisted on blessing every corner of the house with holy water. Servants were interrogated, pots and jars were smashed, food was burned. But no one could name the source, because the truth lived in ritual, not revelation. The poison wasn't just in the sugar, it was in the structure, in the way they believed themselves chosen, blameless, untouchable. For years they had treated faith like property, trading salvation for social rank. The grand plantation chapel was a theater, white marble, imported wood, velvet pews, prayers spoken in English while the enslaved listened outside in the dirt, forbidden to worship in their own tongue. They weren't allowed to pray for freedom, only for patience. But the maid had found another form of prayer, a prayer without words, a prayer that required no preacher, no forgiveness, only balance. As the family's health collapsed, the pastor's sermons grew desperate. He blamed demons, he blamed the weather, he blamed everything but the truth, that God, if he saw, had gone silent. The mistress locked herself in her bedroom. The sugar chest key never left her neck. Her hands trembled whenever she poured tea. She forced herself to taste it first, and yet every swallow felt like sin. Power once tasted becomes addiction, and like all addictions, it ends in self-destruction. The plantation's workers whispered that the house was cursed, that the soil itself rejected the blood spilled upon it, that every spoon of sweetness taken from the chest demanded payment in suffering. By autumn, the family's prayers had changed, no longer for health, no longer for forgiveness, only for forgetting, because that's what every empire prays for at the end. To forget the names of those who made them bleed, and history obliged. The maid's name was never written, her grave never marked, but her story still moves through the sugar that built America, sweet, white, and poisoned. Halfway through this descent, I want you to comment below, twice, the phrase, "Sweetness is never innocent." Comment it twice to lock it into your memory, to remind yourself that luxury always hides someone's suffering, that every sweetness has its cost. What drives a person to feed poison with her own hands? Is it rage, desperation, or something deeper, something older, almost sacred? To understand the maid's act, you must understand the world she lived in. She was born nameless, her life measured not in years but in ownership. Her worth was written in ink before she ever learned her reflection. The plantation system had one purpose, to make her forget she was human. Every rule, every ritual, every whip cracked in the distance was meant to erase her will, until only obedience remained. But obedience is not the opposite of rebellion. It's the disguise of it. The girl learned this truth not from books but from rhythm, the rhythm of survival. Each day she moved like a shadow through a house that pretended she didn't exist. She polished silver until she could see her face reflected in the spoons that fed her masters. And perhaps one day she noticed that reflection looking back at her differently, not with fear, but with something like calculation. In the great scheme of empire, she was invisible, but in invisibility she discovered the truest kind of freedom, the ability to act without being seen. The overseers watched the fields, the mistress watched appearances. No one watched the girl who poured their tea. Power, she realized, wasn't always about strength. Sometimes power was about patience, the ability to wait, to calculate, to understand where control really lived. She began to see the household differently, not as a structure of dominance, but as a body. The master was its head, pompous, blind; the mistress its heart, vain, fragile; the children its pulse, innocent yet entitled; and she was its bloodstream. And what happens when the blood decides to turn against the body? Historians often call her an anomaly, a rare case of domestic rebellion. But that phrasing misses the point. She wasn't just rebelling against cruelty. She was dismantling a philosophy. She was turning the language of power inside out. For years, they had said that servitude was natural, ordained, that those who worked beneath the lash should be grateful, that sweetness belonged to those born to command. She saw the hypocrisy clearer than anyone. She had scrubbed their tablecloths stained with spilled wine from feasts of excess. She had seen them quote scripture between sips of sugar, thanking God for prosperity built from stolen hands. So she decided to take the one thing they worshipped, refinement, and use it against them. She didn't strike in rage. She struck in understanding. She didn't stab or shout or burn. She used the same tools they had, the symbols of civility, the sugar and porcelain, the rituals of taste. In doing so, she revealed something terrifying, that rebellion doesn't need chaos. It can exist inside perfection. Every teaspoon she stirred was a sermon, not about vengeance, but about balance. To her, poison wasn't cruelty, it was correction. Because poison isn't loud, it doesn't demand attention, it waits. It lets arrogance expose itself. It transforms the body from within, the same way injustice transforms a soul. The irony is brutal. The very family that believed itself pure, that measured worth by whiteness and sugar, met its end through the same glittering crystals they adored. When the third child died, the physician still refused to believe it was deliberate. He wrote, "Act of God" on the report. The same phrase used on slave ship manifests when hundreds perished in chains. An act of God. How convenient. But if God acted that summer, it wasn't from the heavens, it was from below. The maid had learned the truth that civilizations fear most, that every empire can be undone from its center, not by armies, but by the hands it thinks it owns. And that's what makes this story dangerous. Because her act wasn't just revenge, it was a philosophy, a revelation about power itself. That domination contains its own poison, that the oppressed do not need permission to balance the scales. Think about it. A girl with no name, no weapons, no voice, shifted the course of her master's bloodline forever. She didn't need freedom to act free. She acted as if she already was. That's the secret every tyrant fears, that freedom is not granted. It's taken silently. By the end of that summer, the house that once glowed with the light of refinement was silent. The sugar chest stood unopened, the teacups gathered dust. The family name would vanish from Virginia land records within a decade. And yet, her act lived on, not in words, but in whispers. In the way servants exchanged glances when masters prayed, in the way sugar, that purest of substances, began to taste faintly of fear. History calls it coincidence. But men of power, even centuries later, still fear sweetness that comes from untrusted hands, because deep down, they remember her. The housemaid's name was never recorded, and that was the plan. Because names can be hunted, but silence cannot. By the final weeks of 1758, the Virginia estate had turned into something between a chapel and a tomb. Curtains drawn, visitors discouraged, meals untouched. The air itself felt thick, metallic, as if the walls had absorbed the sickness. Servants whispered of a curse, of demons, of vengeance. The family doctor wrote a final note. House afflicted by flux. Recommend relocation for the season. But by then, there was no family left to move. The mistress lay in bed, her body pale and thin. The surviving son had been sent to relatives in Richmond. Only the housemaid remained in the kitchen, tending to fires that no one came to warm by. She prepared meals that no one ate. She polished silver that reflected no faces. And then one day, she too was gone. No record of sale, no obituary, no bill of death, just absence. Some said she fled through the marshlands, following hidden paths used by runaways toward freedom in the north. Others whispered she was taken by the woods themselves, the swamp reclaiming its own. The overseer claimed she stole provisions and fled in the night, but his own handwriting betrays doubt. No sign of struggle, all jars sealed, door left open. A door left open, that's not escape, that's message. For weeks, the overseer sent out search parties. Dogs returned with nothing, no footprints in the mud, no torn fabric caught on branches. It was as if the earth had swallowed her. And yet, evidence of her lingered. Not in her body, but in the structure she left behind. In the sugar chest, they found a fine layer of dust. The last jar of crystals half full. Inside, the grains glittered beneath the light. Harmless, beautiful, deadly. The mistress's sister ordered the entire kitchen destroyed. Pots smashed, floors scrubbed with lime, fire set to the hearth. But some things do not burn. Years later, travelers claimed to see faint lights flickering near the ruins of the plantation at night, like candles moving through fog. A woman's figure, bent over a basin, stirring something unseen. Horses refused to pass that road after dark. Locals began to call it the Sweet Hollow. But ghost stories are only half-truths told by the living to hide their guilt. The truth is far simpler and far more frightening. The maid's disappearance wasn't magic, it was mastery. For years she had lived in a system built on record-keeping, on ledgers, on control, on documentation. To vanish from that system was the ultimate rebellion. She denied them what they valued most, ownership. They could write her name once in ink, but they could never own her silence. Historians call it archival death, the moment a person disappears from paper but continues in memory. It's how enslaved people rewrote their own destinies through absence. To be unrecorded was to be free from pursuit. The housemaid understood that. Whether by choice or consequence, she removed herself from history's ledger, not as a victim, but as an architect. Her vanishing became her final act of control. Think of it, an empire built on control, undone by a woman who simply stopped existing on their terms. And here's the part that no textbook includes. Months after her disappearance, plantation owners across Virginia began locking their sugar chests. Some even banned servants from handling the sweet entirely. Rumors spread that a maid's poison travels through bloodlines, that it marks every descendant who profits from the trade. Families changed recipes, wives poured their own tea, children were told stories about tainted sweetness that should never be touched. Fear, not justice, became her monument. And maybe that was the point. The real punishment wasn't death. It was contamination, not of food, but of certainty, of power, of purity. Because from that moment on, every cup of tea served in Virginia carried a question no one dared ask. Who stirred this? The plantation was later sold, then abandoned, then erased. By the 1820s, travelers' maps marked it only as the old house. By the 1840s, the land had returned to wild growth, and in the archives, the ledger still exists, warped by heat, the ink faintly bleeding where the quill pressed too hard. Beside the entry for kitchen maid, age 19, someone had drawn a small mark, a cross, or perhaps a scar. Maybe a priest's symbol, maybe a warning, maybe, just maybe, the only sign that someone, somewhere, wanted her remembered. But history does not forgive those who refuse its rules. It forgets them, and that is how she won. Because in the story of America's beginning, a story drenched in sugar, blood, and prayer, her silence remains the one truth that power cannot erase. By the turn of the century, the fields where her story began had grown wild, vines coiling over the stone foundations, the air thick with the hum of insects. The people who inherited that land no longer spoke her name because they never knew it. But they felt her. Silence has a way of planting roots. In the autumn months, when the harvest moon hung low and the nights grew long, workers claimed to hear faint sounds drifting from the ruins. The clang of pots, The soft scrape of a spoon against metal, the whisper of a woman humming a tune too old to trace. Some said the sound came from beneath the ground itself, as though the soil remembered what it had swallowed. The plantation, now called Sweet Hollow, became a place of unease. Crops refused to grow near the old kitchen. Horses balked, tools went missing. Travelers avoided it at dusk, saying the wind carried the smell of burnt sugar and sickness. But superstition, as always, is the mask of truth. The fear that lingered over that land wasn't about ghosts. It was about guilt. The planters' descendants tried to forget what had happened, to call it an old wives' tale. But in the privacy of their own homes, they still locked the sugar chests. They still hesitated before sweetening their tea. The story had done its work, not by surviving in writing, but by infecting the imagination of power itself. That was her real legacy. Contamination of certainty. Because when those who control the world begin to fear what they consume, their empire begins to crumble from the inside. The unnamed maid, the girl who folded death into sugar, had achieved what revolutions could not. She turned dependence into paranoia. She made every household a battlefield of invisible war. Every teaspoon became a question of trust. It was said that even in Charleston and Savannah, wealthy wives began instructing their servants to taste first. Some even dismissed their cooks, fearing the legend might spread. But the legend already had. It moved faster than trade, carried by gossip, by sailors, by whispers between markets. Sweetness itself had become suspicious. Historians found fragments of letters, one from a merchant's wife in Williamsburg to her sister in London. They speak of a colored girl who poisoned her masters in Virginia some years past. I cannot bring myself to drink tea unless I stir it myself. There are eyes in the kitchen that unsettle me. Fear is the purest form of remembrance. It keeps the forgotten alive. The silence she left behind began to harvest its own kind of power. The enslaved across plantations heard the tale in pieces, transformed through retelling. In one version, she fled north and became a midwife who only delivered children on stormy nights. In another, she poisoned entire banquets before disappearing into the woods, guided by ancestral spirits. It didn't matter which version was true. The meaning was, she had become an idea, proof that even the smallest act could unmake the illusion of control. The enslaved began to whisper a phrase in their dialects. Sweetness remembers. It wasn't a prayer, it was a warning, because power depends on forgetting. Every empire, every plantation, every system of domination relies on the same illusion, that suffering can be erased by ritual, that obedience lasts forever. The maid's silence defied that. She turned forgetting into rebellion. She never needed fame. She needed myth. By the 1800s, when abolitionists began to speak of the cruelty of sugar, how it was white gold soaked in black blood, her story resurfaced like a wound reopened. Writers spoke of the Virginia poisoner, the maid who fed revenge to empire. Preachers denounced her as a demon. Scholars dismissed her as folklore. But folklore is how forbidden truths survive. Every lie that empire tells creates its opposite in secret. Every attempt to erase a name gives birth to a legend that cannot die. And so, when travelers crossed the old roads at night and saw lights flickering in Sweet Hollow, they weren't seeing a ghost. They were seeing consequence. They were seeing what happens when cruelty thinks it can bury what it built itself upon. Some say the earth still carries her story, that when storms roll through Virginia, the rain turns sweet for a moment before the thunder cracks. The old people say it's her, stirring again. And if you listen closely enough, in the hush after the wind, you might still hear her whisper, I fed them what they gave me. Because the harvest of silence is not emptiness, it is transformation. By 1760, sugar had become the heartbeat of empire, the quiet empire of taste. England's wealth, France's elegance, America's refinement. All were built upon white crystals that shimmered like innocence. But behind every teaspoon lay a grave. You can trace the entire world's moral decay through the path of sugar. From the fields of Barbados to the ports of Norfolk, from the boiling houses of Jamaica to the salons of Virginia, sweetness carried death in every shipment, and still they called it progress. The planters, merchants, and politicians, The men who toasted themselves as visionaries believed sugar was proof of divine favor. They saw no contradiction in baptizing their prophets in scripture. God has blessed our trade, they wrote, for the good of civilization. Civilization. That word, repeated like a prayer, became the new name for control. The poison the housemaid stirred in Virginia was not just chemical. It was symbolic. It showed that the empire's foundation, refinement, civility, faith, could all be corrupted from within, by the very substance that represented its purity. And the curse spread, not through sorcery, but through psychology. By the late 18th century, plantation owners began reporting mysterious misfortunes. Entire families stricken with strange fevers, sugar shipments rotting in storage, fires starting from nowhere. Clergymen called it the sweet affliction. Doctors dismissed it as tropical disease. But the slaves whispered another explanation: the sugar remembers. The legend of the Virginia maid had become contagion, not of the body, but of conscience. In Barbados, a planter's son supposedly woke screaming that a woman's shadow had walked across his tongue. In Louisiana, a merchant's daughter refused to eat anything sweet, saying it tasted like guilt. Letters written by clergymen in Charleston mention an unholy rumor spreading among the kitchens, a fear that God himself had withdrawn from the sugar trade. Even Parliament took notice. A report from 1772 warned of rising unrest among the house staff, inspired by tales of rebellion through poison. They called it a superstition of the colonies, unaware that fear itself had become rebellion. Because fear, once planted in power, grows faster than justice. Sugar, that perfect metaphor for control, began to turn on its masters. The same substance that symbolized grace now symbolized deceit. To sweeten one's tea became to risk one's life. To serve dessert became an act of suspicion. The theater of gentility collapsed under its own weight. The curse of the Virginia maid wasn't about death, it was about reversal. The enslaved had learned to weaponize the master's own illusion. They understood what philosophers in Europe could not, that oppression always gives its victims the blueprint for revenge. And in that knowledge lay a quiet, devastating power. Even after emancipation, even after revolutions and wars, the story endured. It traveled not by ink, but by blood memory. Mothers told their daughters to stir tea slowly, to never trust the first taste. Old cooks passed down a ritual, to sprinkle 3 grains of salt before touching sugar, to remind it of the sea it came from. And perhaps that's why the legend persists, because sugar never lost its shadow. Every empire that tried to purify it ended up corrupted. England built its wealth upon it and nearly starved itself to madness in the industrial age. France glorified it and watched its revolution consume its nobility. America sweetened its democracy with it and still carries its addiction. The Maid's Act became prophecy. The sweetness you exploit will one day exploit you. The curse of sugar is the curse of power. Once you taste it, you cannot stop, even when it begins to rot you from the inside. Some scholars today try to rationalize the legend. They say no records confirm her existence, that the poisonings were coincidence. But that's the point. Power always demands evidence before it admits guilt, and legends are how the guilty are remembered when records are destroyed. If you look at the ledgers today, those brittle pages from the Virginia estate, the ones warped by heat, you'll see something strange. At the very bottom, after the final entry, written faintly in a different hand, sweetness will answer for itself. No one knows who wrote it. The handwriting doesn't match the master's nor the bookkeeper's. Some say it was added later, but when archivists tested the ink, they found it older than the final entries, as if the words had been waiting beneath the page all along. Maybe she wrote it herself. Maybe it was never ink at all, but ash. What we do know is this: from the moment she vanished, sugar was never innocent again. History, like sugar, is refined through violence. What reaches us centuries later is the polished version, stripped of bitterness, bleached of guilt, packaged for the palate of power. But beneath the sweetness of every written record, there is sediment. There is what was hidden. And sometimes what was hidden comes back. In 1891, a historian named Elias Trenton visited what was left of the old Virginia estate, a patch of overgrown land still known by locals as Sweet Hollow. He'd heard rumors of a poison legend, a whisper about a housemaid who killed her masters with sugar. He thought it was myth, until he saw what the soil had preserved. Trenton wrote in his diary, now held in the Library of Virginia, "Beneath the foundation stones of what must have been the kitchen, we found jars, 3 of them, clay, sealed with wax. Inside, a fine white dust, glittering faintly. At first, I believed it to be sugar. Then, with a stick, I disturbed it, and the air seemed to sicken. The jars were buried in a triangle, deliberate, symmetrical, ritual." Trenton described a faint symbol carved into the wax, an X crossed twice. When he returned to his inn that evening, his hands blistered. He wrote of nightmares. A woman standing by a fire, stirring endlessly, whispering something he couldn't understand. He died 3 days later. The local paper called it infection. The villagers called it justice. The university called it coincidence. But the jars were sealed again and sent north for testing. No report was ever published. And just like that, the legend was archived again, buried beneath the language of science and scholarship. But you can't bury vibration. Every place holds memory. The soil remembers weight. The air remembers breath. And Sweet Hollow remembered her. Visitors began reporting the same thing Trenton had described, the scent of burnt sugar when no fire was lit, the sound of a spoon scraping metal, the feeling of being watched by something not cruel, but corrective. The legend grew until the state fenced off the land. No one was permitted to dig, officially for safety, unofficially for fear. Because deep down, they knew what the jars were, not poison, not evidence, a warning. 3 jars for 3 children, buried in the kitchen earth so that the land itself would never forget. Each grain a prayer for balance, for the reversal of roles, for the endless remembrance of injustice disguised as sweetness. Archaeologists who revisited the site in 1934 found only fragments of glass, but in the archives the notes remain. The handwriting grows unsteady toward the end, the last line crossed out halfway. The sweetness burns the tongue even when untasted. No one ever published those findings. The documents were locked away in the university's anthropology wing, labeled simply Virginia, 1758. Domestic rebellion folklore. But there's something you need to understand. When an institution labels something folklore, it's not because it's false, it's because it's dangerous. Because the truth inside this story isn't just historical, it's structural. It reveals the machinery beneath civilization itself, the illusion of refinement built upon coercion, of morality built upon exploitation, of purity built upon erasure. The unnamed Maids Act tore a hole in that illusion, and the hole never closed. Every attempt to study Sweet Hollow fails for the same reason. You cannot study a wound that still bleeds. You can only acknowledge what made it. And maybe that's why the legend refuses to die. Because she wasn't a witch. She wasn't a servant. She was the first mirror America ever faced. The reflection of its own appetite staring bead. Silent and unblinking. When you read the surviving ledgers now, you can still smell the faint sweetness of decay on the paper. The ink has browned, but it glows faintly under candlelight. Some archivists refuse to touch it after dark. They say if you lean close enough, you can hear the scratch of another pen, still writing, still correcting. Sweetness will answer for itself. That phrase appears again, burned faintly into the edge of the parchment, and no one knows how it got there. Maybe that's the real forbidden record, not the ledger, not the jars, but the echo that won't fade, the vibration that moves through every act of history where power pretends innocence, and that echo asks one question, one that no empire has ever been able to silence. When the sweetness is gone, what will be left of you? They say every story ends in silence. But that's not true. Some stories end in memory, and memory never sleeps. The tale of the unnamed maid doesn't rest in a grave. It breathes through the world she helped expose. Every spoonful of sugar, Every performance of civility, every system that claims purity while feeding on submission, carries her signature, invisible but permanent. The world thinks of her as a servant, but she was a philosopher, the kind that history refuses to name, because what she understood, without books or sermons or titles, was this: that power is not destroyed by confrontation, it's dissolved by consequence. That vengeance is not the opposite of grace, it is its truest form, returned in the language the oppressor can understand. That silence, wielded correctly, becomes the sharpest weapon ever made, and so the maid's doctrine was born, not written, but lived. The first principle: every empire poisons itself. When domination becomes ritual, when cruelty becomes custom, when luxury depends on blindness, the infection begins. It may take years, generations, or centuries, but it spreads, and the poison will always come from within. The second principle: sweetness is never innocent. Pleasure is how corruption disguises itself. The world loves things that sparkle: sugar, gold, scripture, refinement. But every sweetness is built on someone's suffering. The maid didn't create the poison, she merely gave it back. The third principle: erasure is a form of confession. When they removed her name from the ledger, they didn't erase her. They revealed their fear. Erasure is what guilty systems do when truth gets too close. But in removing her identity, they made her universal. She became every unnamed voice, every vanished hand, every silence that refuses to stay buried. The fourth principle: silence is a language. Power believes silence means obedience. It never suspects that silence might mean strategy. The maid spoke through absence, through ritual, through the weight of what she didn't say. She turned invisibility into armor. The final principle: the body remembers what history forgets. Even if archives burn, even if names vanish, the body, the land, the air, the bloodline, remembers. The sugar remembers. The soil remembers. And somewhere, so do you. Because stories like hers do not end. They reincarnate. Every time a worker is silenced, every time wealth disguises itself as virtue, every time sweetness hides a wound, the doctrine stirs again. Her story isn't about revenge, it's about equilibrium, about restoring balance in a world addicted to hierarchy. Look at the empires that followed hers, each one repeating the same cycle: exploitation dressed as progress, power disguised as faith, each one believing they were untouchable until silence began to whisper again. That whisper is her, the maid of Virginia, the girl they erased, is still teaching, not through sermons but through consequence. Every time power consumes too much, something in the universe answers back. And maybe that's the truest justice of all, because justice doesn't arrive like thunder, it seeps in like sugar, invisible, dissolving slowly, sweet at first, then unbearable. So when you drink your tea tomorrow morning and the crystals melt away without a trace, think of her. Think of the unnamed girl who fed poison not out of hatred, but out of truth, to show that sweetness and suffering were never separate things. And as you swallow, ask yourself the question that terrified an empire into silence. What if the sweetness in your life was bought with someone else's pain? The story of the maid is not a tragedy. It is prophecy. It is what happens when the invisible decide to be remembered, not by name, but by balance. Her voice is still here, hidden beneath the taste of luxury, whispering through every civilization that mistakes refinement for righteousness. Sweetness will answer for itself. Say it aloud, whisper it once, then again. Because some truths demand to be repeated, sweetness will answer for itself. Sweetness will answer for itself. And in that echo the past returns, not to haunt, but to remind, that no empire, however holy, however wealthy, however sweet, escapes the taste of its own poison.